How Apple became richer than countries in 1997. Apple was worth $3 billion and losing money every single quarter. Steve Jobs had just come back to save the company he'd been kicked out of. By 2018, Apple became the first company in history to reach $1 trillion valuation. That's more wealth than the entire GDP of every country on Earth except for five. Today, we're breaking down how a computer company became so impossibly wealthy that it now has more money than most nations' governments will ever see. Here's the thing that blows my mind. When you compare Apple's market value to a country's GDP, you're not just looking at a number anymore. You're looking at a company that employs 161,000 people, controls the devices in 2 billion people's pockets, and generates more cash flow in a single year than some nations generate in a decade. So, how did we get here? Let's rewind to 1976. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak built computers in a garage. No factory, no supply chain, no global distribution. Just two kids and a dream. For nearly 20 years, they stayed relatively small, big but not dominant. IBM owned the PC market. Microsoft was eating their lunch. Apple was the quirky underdog that maybe 5% of people bought. Then in 2001, something changed. Steve Jobs walked on stage and introduced the iPod, a tiny device that could hold 1,000 songs. Nobody needed it, everyone wanted it. This is the moment most people miss, because the iPod wasn't just a music player, it was Apple's first hit in the consumer lifestyle space. It was the beginning of the ecosystem trap. See, once you bought an iPod, you downloaded iTunes. Once you had iTunes, you had to buy music from Apple. Once you had music from Apple, you couldn't use it on a Samsung device. You were locked in, and locked in customers are the most profitable customers in the world because they can't leave. By 2007, Apple had perfected this system with the iPhone, a device so revolutionary that it essentially killed every other phone manufacturer's entire business model. BlackBerry, gone. Nokia, obliterated. HTC, forgotten. Apple didn't just win the smartphone war, they won so decisively that they permanently changed what a company could charge for a device. Here's the part that matters. Before the iPhone, a premium phone cost $300 to $10 if you were lucky. Apple convinced the world that a phone could cost $800, then $1,000, then $1,200. Competitors had to follow or disappear. Samsung adapted, Google adapted. Everyone else died. But here's what actually makes Apple richer than countries. It's not the phones, it's the profit margin. When China manufactures an iPhone, the actual cost to make it is roughly $300. Apple sells it for $1,200. That's a 75% gross margin on every single device sold. Now multiply that by the fact that Apple sells over 250 million iPhones every year. That's $225 billion in revenue from phones alone. Add in iPads, Macs, watches, AirPods, and the real moneymaker we're about to talk about, services. Apple's services business is now worth more than the entire fortune of most billionaires. When you pay for iCloud storage, Apple Music, App Store apps, Apple Care, and all the other subscriptions, that money goes directly to Apple's pocket with almost zero manufacturing cost. In 2023, services generated $85 billion in pure profit. Here's the crazy part. Apple doesn't need to grow anymore. They've already captured the market. What they're doing now is pure extraction. They've convinced billions of people that they need to upgrade their phone every 2 to 3 years, even though the old phone still works perfectly fine. The new phone is 10% faster, the camera is slightly better, but you feel like you need it anyway. This is called the replacement cycle, and it's the most lucrative business model ever created. Nike sells you shoes, you wear them out, you buy new shoes. Apple sells you a $1,200 device that still works, makes you feel like it's outdated, and you pay $1,200 again. The average Apple customer now spends $1,000 per year on Apple products and services. Multiply that by 1.2 billion customers. That's $1.2 trillion in annual spending on Apple's ecosystem. Even if Apple only captures 30% of that as profit, that's $360 billion per year. The United States federal government's budget is $6 trillion per year. The UK's entire GDP is $3.3 trillion. Saudi Arabia's GDP is $1.1 trillion. Apple's annual profit alone could fund the entire government of Saudi Arabia and still have money left over. But here's what makes this even more wild. Apple doesn't pay most of that money in taxes. Through legal loopholes and offshore subsidiaries, Apple paid an effective tax rate of just 16% globally, while the United States corporate tax rate is supposedly 21%. That means Apple keeps $300 billion of its $360 billion annual profit. That's pure wealth accumulation at a scale that makes traditional billionaires look broke. The real question is, how did Apple convince the entire world that this was okay? The answer is simple. They made it beautiful. They made it simple. They made you feel like you weren't buying a product, you were joining a lifestyle. When you hold an iPhone, you're not thinking about the 75% profit margin. You're thinking about how good it feels in your hand. You're thinking about the status symbol. You're thinking about your entire digital life being conveniently connected. This is the trap, and we all walked into it willingly. Apple's wealth isn't just about business, it's about psychology. It's about creating a product so integrated into your life that leaving feels impossible. Your photos are on iCloud, your location history is on Apple, your payment method is Apple Pay, your music is in Apple Music. Leaving Apple means losing all of that. Countries, by comparison, have governments that can print money, collect taxes, and redistribute wealth. Apple just has you. And you keep giving them money every year because the alternative feels worse than staying. So Apple is richer than countries, not because they're smarter, but because they've created the most efficient wealth extraction machine ever invented. It's not slavery because you're free to leave. It's just that leaving costs you everything you've already invested in the ecosystem. And the most genius part, they're not done. Apple is currently moving into financial services, health monitoring, and spatial computing. Each new product is just another chain in the lock-in system. So Apple didn't just become richer than countries, they became something more powerful than countries. They became inevitable.